Well, it seems the defects disaster is even worse than we thought. The tip of the iceberg, said a report on the weekend. I'm Jimmy Thompson. I edit the Flat Chat website and write the column in the Australian Financial Review every weekend.
And I'm Sue Williams, property writer and journalist.
And this is the Flat Chat Wrap. So, Sue, tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, when you say it's worse than we thought, well, probably worse than most people thought, but maybe not worse than we thought.
No, that's true. We've known about this for ages and been telling people about it for ages, and they haven't been listening, but now they know.
Yeah, I just remember 15 years ago I was working for a newspaper and I wrote a piece about defects, and it was pulled at the last minute when another journalist, a colleague, reported to a developer that the story was going ahead about lots of buildings being ridden by defects. The page was pulled because of fears that the newspaper might lose some advertising. And I nearly quit my job over it,
well,
really.
I remember that incident because the reporter, well, an alleged reporter, phoned up the developer and the developer phoned the editor and said, if this story goes in, we're pulling our advertising.
So the situation has been going on for a long time, but this is the first time it's really kind of put its head above the parapet, which is fantastic, really. I mean, it's horrific to see the extent of the defects, but it's nice now that people at last know what's happening.
Yeah, because, you know, that story in the Sydney Morning Herald at the weekend, it listed a whole bunch of settlements that have been done and various apartment blocks for defects. These are either court rulings or settlements. You know, like I'm looking at one that's in Mona Vale for 2.6 million, another one for 850,000 down in Sanssouci. It's a lot of money. And then it turns out that there's a lot that we don't hear about that don't get listed because they've come to an agreement, and part of the agreement is a non-disclosure.
Absolutely. And there's also a lot more from buildings that don't really want to face up to the issues because they don't want anyone to know about it because it will affect the value of their building. So they kind of chug along hoping that the building won't fall apart.
The problems will fix themselves. And no one will find out about it, and
or they
can sell it.
Yeah, they get cracks in the walls of their apartment, but they fix them themselves. They get someone in.
Yeah, you know. But it doesn't fix the underlying problem a lot of the time. So that's waiting there for some unwary person,
sure.
Which is something I'll be writing about in this weekend's Financial Review. How do you avoid buying an apartment that's going to fall down?
Oh, that's going to be an interesting one.
Yeah, don't buy an apartment would be one way, but I'm not encouraging people to not live in apartments.
No, because we love apartment living. We were talking to a friend last night who we were all saying, you know, we would hate to live in houses now. Apartments just offer such a wonderful lifestyle when you get a good apartment.
Yeah.
We just want to make sure more people get good apartments.
And that's the key, isn't it? So what is it? What contributes to this problem with all these defects? I mean, we heard about self-certification in the past where developers paid the certifier just to say everything was okay. But it seems to me that there's two underlying issues, one of which is the duty of care issue.
That's right, because builders don't actually have a duty of care to owners, do they?
No, the builder's duty of care is to the developer, and they say, and they've argued this successfully in court at a very senior level, that they can't have a duty of care to the owner's corporation because the owner's corporation didn't exist when the building was built, more to the point, when the contracts were signed. So they're saying, how can we have a duty of care to an organisation that didn't exist? There was a big conference behind closed doors in Sydney last week where this came up about the duty of care, much to the surprise of some of the people there that it was even being raised. But that's a key issue. And it's a key issue because of the other big problem, which is phoenixing, which is where a developer sets up in business, builds a building, and then shuts down their company, which is, you know, a $200 off the peg company before all the bills come in. And if the builder has no duty of care to anyone but the developer, and the developer has gone, then who's going to fix the problems?
So I guess then you would always be a little bit wary or a little bit careful about development companies that set up special companies to develop certain blocks and just name the company after the address of the building they're doing.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, even some of the biggest, best-known companies have started doing, It's like a Flat Chat Developers at 1 George Street is the name of the company. And people look at it and go, oh yeah, that's the developer and that's the address, that's fine. They don't realise that the company has been set up to be closed down.
Well, not always, but makes
obviously.
it much more simple to close down if there are issues.
Yeah, because it protects the parent company from claims that arise
all
from
their
that.
assets.
Yeah. Which is cheating, in my view.
It is, because often those companies will close down and then you'll notice another development later on with the same directors of that company involved.
And that's what I'll be saying at the weekend. How do you spot these companies? It's actually a lot easier than you would think if you know where to look.
Good. And how do you stamp out phoenixing? Because that's such a big issue, isn't it, as well?
Well, the excuse that the government uses is that strata law and planning law are all state controlled. That's by the individual states. And company law is a federal law. So they say that it's too hard to combine state law and federal law to get some way of preventing people from doing this thing of shutting down a company and then starting up and doing exactly the same thing again and again and again. There are people like our good friend Stephen Goddard,
the strata lawyer and the spokesperson for the Owners Corporation Network.
Thank you for that. Yes. He says this is rubbish. They're not trying hard enough.
Well, how hard is it for someone from Sydney and someone from Melbourne to go over to Canberra and work it all out?
Well, exactly. There's a big meeting next week of the planning ministers, and maybe they'll put that on the agenda if it's not already there. And one of the other solutions, we'll talk about that in a minute. So we're talking about this big messy mess of defects. And one of the solutions proposed in New South Wales is the creation of a building commissioner. Right, it's a new role high up in the whole building planning universe. But who is it? What will they do? What will their powers be?
A bit of a poison chalice as well, isn't it, really? That building commissioner, everybody will be blaming him or her if anything goes wrong. And if they don't have the power to fix situations immediately, it's going to be really difficult. They're going to have to be able to negotiate with both sides of Parliament, really. And they've got to be able to tell developers what's happening. They've got to be given quite strong powers, I think.
Yeah, but I don't think they're going to come riding in a van with flashing lights and drive up to a development and go, hang on a minute, you're doing something wrong here, stop work immediately.
Why not? I'd love to see that.
I don't think they'll have the resources for a start, and I don't think the laws are in place. You'd have to have a whole raft of laws. I see the building commissioner as being somebody who'll come in, look at all the issues. For instance, we made a joke about Flat Chat Developers. We could literally just set up a company called that, Flat Chat Developments. And if there is a company out there called Flat Chat Developments, I apologize. But we could set up a company with any name, call ourselves developers, get loans from the bank, find somewhere, get some builders. We could become developers. Qualifications, zero. Actually, we're probably better qualified than many of the developments that are starting up. And that could be something that the commissioner could be and should be looking at, is some sort of regulation and certification of developers.
And certification of engineers as well.
Yeah.
Because, lots of engineers say we need to have a proper certified system, because some people can set themselves up as engineers really without many qualifications.
Chatting to Stephen Goddard, the architects and engineers, if they sign off on their plans and say this plan has been designed to code, then the builders should sign off and say we are going to build to that plan. Because as we know, what happens is often the architects and engineers come in and they work out how to put the building together, what it's going to look like and how it's all going to fit together. And then the developer comes in and says, well, I can save some money by not doing that and by not doing that. And that makes perfect sense to me. You start with the design, which has been approved by the council. So the planners, the architects and the engineers all sign off and say, this is the plan that will work. And the builders have to build to that plan.
No, it's good. Because when you think, who are the independent people on site? They're the engineers and the architects.
Yeah.
And I talked to lots of architects last week because I was doing a story on the New South Wales Architecture Awards.
Yep.
And all the ones who develop apartment buildings were all saying, we really need to be one of the certifying authorities because we're independent. We have the interests of the owners at heart because we want to build great buildings that last for a long time and that people are really proud of. And we're the ones who understand the plans, the design, how it's put together, and we should be the ones certifying these buildings.
Now, your developer's going to say, yeah, but that's going to be hugely expensive, all these fancy Dan architects with their crazy ideas.
But they don't have crazy ideas. I mean, they're very used now to working within budgets. They're often working with materials which aren't very expensive anymore. I mean, one of the architects I talked to was talking about a building where all the facade was just raw concrete because he said that weathers really well, it looks really good, it lasts a long, long time, and it's much better than, cheap cladding which might provide a bit of glitter for the first couple of years and then
go on fire.
Well, that's right. But these are really very sensible architects who have a good idea about working to a budget and working within constraints.
But that would get rid of the design and construct.
That's right.
Where the developer says, I want an 8-story apartment block and here's my off the peg designs for the floor plans, and the builder goes, yeah, I can do that, and just give me the plans and give me the council approval and give me the money and I'll do it. And of course the potential for disaster that creates.
Yeah.
Having said that, I'm sure there are some builders who are perfectly capable of building, good solid blocks and do so.
Absolutely. But before design and construct came in, architects were always signing off on buildings. They were in there at the heart of the action.
Yeah.
And we don't have many building problems from buildings 20 years old.
No,
really.
apart from the fact that they're old, and the fact that they're still standing up is a testimony to a system that worked.
Because you look at some of the buildings being built today and you think, will they still be around in 20 years, 30 years, 50 years?
Some of them are sinking before our very eyes.
Yeah, that's
right. It's not very hopeful.
And it's interesting as well, when you look at some of the big developers, they actually have their own building companies as well. So that's really interesting. They're the developers, they're the builders, they have their own design and an own architecture team as well.
Yeah.
And those companies, you think you'd avoid some of the problems. And there are other buildings where the developers hold on to the buildings.
Yeah.
They decide that they love the building so much and they rent out the apartments. They might sell a few, but they rent out others. And they actually then have a real interest in making sure a building is going to last and look good for a long time.
Are they not just trying to avoid defects being pursued?
Oh, you're cynical. Maybe that's a possibility, but some of them, I think, are actually genuinely proud of their buildings and want to hold on to them.
Yeah, and the listeners should know that a large ginger cat just jumped up on our table, so that's for the sound effects if you heard them. Right, well, we've spoken a lot about architects. We'll talk about the Architecture Awards you mentioned after this break. So, Sue, you've been writing about architects and the Architecture Awards.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been really interesting because obviously you look at houses and then you look at apartments. And some of the apartment buildings this year were pretty fabulous. And everyone's talking about how design standards are going up, while, ironically, building standards are plummeting.
Right, yeah.
So that's a real shame. But it gave some of the architects a platform to talk about how they felt that they should contribute to the construction process as well.
And what were the outstanding buildings in your view?
Well, the winner of the top award was a complex in North Rocks, which is in the Hills district of Sydney.
Right.
And that's interesting because North Rocks isn't an area particularly well known for its fabulous apartment buildings, but this was an extremely good one. It won the Aaron Bolot Award for Angelo Candelapis of Candelapis Associates. It's a really big building built in a series of blocks. It looks quite stern. One of the judges said it looked a little bit Soviet.
Ooh.
And I put that to Angelo, and he was a bit miffed by that. But
I bet he was.
Yeah, but then he started saying, but if by that they mean there's a real equality for the residents and a real kind of enduring element, he worked very hard to try and kind of turn it into a positive, really. But yeah, that was a really good building.
So what were the other buildings?
In Hurstville, Frank Stanisic won the Architecture Award for a really beautiful building, and that has lots of areas where there's plenty of external sky terraces or kind of communal gardens where residents can get together. So families can go there because there's lots of places for kids' birthday parties and stuff. And that's really nice because I think architects now are very aware that when you're designing apartments, you're building communities.
Yes.
And they want communities of all sorts of different people, families, older people, younger people, couples starting out. They want everybody to be in those buildings and have great spaces as well as good apartments as well.
Right.
And interestingly, another winner was a student accommodation block.
Right.
Which was built in Redfern. And that was a winner under the multiple housing category, which is odd because it was up against some big luxurious apartment buildings.
Is that the one that started off as 2 terraced houses?
Started off as 10 terraced houses.
10 terraced houses, okay.
That's right, yeah.
And did they manage to retain the facades?
They did. And that's why they were praised so highly by the judges, because they kept the facades and they turned the lower ground floors into cafes and restaurants and convenience stores, all the kind of things that students might like to shop at, really.
Yep.
So they've created this real buzzy little street, a little bit like Spice Alley in Chippendale.
Right.
It looks very much like that.
Yep.
And it's of that era. It's kept the red brick that we know so well from Redfern.
Yep.
So it looks really good at ground level. They've created a laneway between the buildings. And then, of course, the building, I think, is about 13 stories high.
Right.
And there they were praised as well for having communal spaces, lots of spaces where students can go and chat together, they can study together, which is really important too, because especially with overseas students, you know, they can be quite isolated.
Yeah.
They're put into fairly small studios, really.
Yeah.
And they can have mental health issues because they don't have much of a social life because they don't have much money. So if there are these special areas where they can go, meet other students, sit there and read a book, have a chat over a cup of coffee, that's a fantastic thing.
Yeah, because it does seem that trends are moving in different directions. When quite near us here is a new boarding house going up. They're taking over a garage space on a corner. It's a corner where people dump their old furniture. It's next to an existing boarding house, but they're putting up this very space-agey place, and it will be, I'm guessing, well, what they're saying is, you know, this is not for, you know, one of these boarding houses for indigent gentlemen or that kind of thing. It's for young singles who are just coming into the area, you know, want to get a foothold in the area, get an idea of what's around them, so they can live reasonably economically in the heart of the city.
That's right. These are called new generation boarding houses, and they're so different from the grotty old places that we remember from years ago. You know, when people just came out of prison, they were put in there, and, you know, people who were really down on their luck. These are kind of really quite vibrant spaces, really well designed usually, and they have a lot of young people going in there because some young people obviously don't earn very much. It is really affordable accommodation. Other young people might decide that they'd like to spend more money on their lifestyle. You know, it's millennials for you, rather than spending, you know, half of their income on a place to live. So they're actually a really good addition to the housing landscape, I think. And everybody talks about how we need much more variegated housing, and this is one way of providing it.
Yeah, the only problem I can see is that the people who own the garages own a boarding house right next door, and the space age building is going to make their boarding house look even older and crappier than it does. Well, maybe they'll paint it or something.
Well, one hopes maybe they'll say to the architects, oh, why don't you come over and renovate our building?
Come inside, have a look, see what you can do with this. And on that positive note, thanks so much, Sue, for coming in and talk to us again.
Pleasure, Jimmy.
And I'm sure we'll be talking again soon. Before we go, an amazing thing has happened in the past couple of weeks. We've had the 10,000th download from this podcast series. So thanks for listening, especially if you found us recently and have gone back into the archives to look for more. If you're listening to the podcast for the first time, you can subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever podcatcher platform you use, and new episodes will be delivered to you pretty much as soon as we post them, and it's all for free. If you're not into podding, you can catch us now on YouTube as well. And of course, if you have any questions about living in strata, or just want to find out what's going on generally, go to our website, flat-chat.com.au. That's all for this week. Thanks again for listening. I'm Jimmy Thompson. Talk to you again soon.